Back to our church history class, and we're on chapter 7, and we're looking at the High Middle Ages, so kind of coming out of the Crusade period and the Inquisition period. So now we're looking at the 12, 13, 1400s, kind of in that era, kind of leading up to the next couple chapters, the Renaissance and the Reformation there in the 1500s. So again, look at 1300s, 1400s here today as we continue on through church history. And so the first thing that we want to talk about is the idea, super important, that the university system is something that kind of comes out of the Catholic Church during these times. I put a couple of the major ones down here. There are many others. So the University of Paris is founded in 1175, a couple of years, about 100 years before that. The University of Bologna in Italy. There were universities springing up in Spain and lots of other places as well, many others. So this idea of the universities really kind of this recognition that, and it's awesome that it's coming from the church, right? So often people think about, that the church, hates people being smart and knowing things, or that if you're smart enough, then you're not going to be a Catholic, the church wants us, is trying to drag everyone back to the Dark Ages and hates science and all of these kinds of ideas about Catholicism, when in reality, what we see is this real flourishing of education under Catholicism from within the church, right? Even as in our own day, we see in the United States over the last 300 years or so, Catholic high schools and grade schools really exploding in the United States, as they have in other places too, but particularly here. So we have this long tradition of education and, again, particularly, 1,000 years ago almost, this creation, really this rising up of this university system really leads to this whole kind of cultural awakening that happens in the wake of that, and which leads to the Renaissance and so on and so forth. So I think when you hear this idea that Catholicism is anti-intellectualism, or is somehow superstition and that kind of stuff, know that the university system and high school and grade school systems, in many ways, came out of the church and come from the church. And that's a source of great pride for us, and it should be for us. And so I wanted to highlight that as one of the first things that kind of happened, we want to call attention to in the kind of this high Middle Age period. And so out of that, we see as well as this education system really begins to explode and really raise the level of the intellectual tradition all throughout Europe and throughout wherever the church is found. We see the rise of this kind of what we call, you might hear this referred to that, it's not that you need to necessarily remember that word or memorize it, but you see this rise in what is called Scholasticism. And Scholasticism is this movement within the church as these universities are starting to really raise the bar in terms of people's education and levels. There's this real intense focus on the intelligence within the church, and kind of they really wrestled with a lot and answered a lot of questions and looked at questions, really dive in and continued. Scholasticism, this idea of learning about the faith and really analyzing it and diving in with logic and reason and intelligence and asking these questions is with us still today, thanks be to God, right? And it really began also with the Crusaders. When they, as we talked last week, the Crusaders would kind of venture out into the eastern part of the world at the time. So, over by Constantinople, Jerusalem, some of these places. What happens is that they bring back with them when they come home, over here, there's this preservation of a guy named Aristotle, who was a Greek philosopher, right? His writings had not really survived over here in Europe so much as they had survived in the eastern part of the world. And so Aristotle, who was writing before Christ, so several hundred years before Christ, and is one of the great thinkers in the world, his works are brought back to Europe and in the wake of the Crusades. You have this rising intellectual ability because of the universities that are really exploding in the Catholic world and in the West. And so what we have on the scene here is probably then, in the midst of this, the greatest thinker in the history of the church, and his name is St. Thomas Aquinas, and we've talked about him before, right? St. Thomas Aquinas, if you pick up a book of his and start reading it, you will instantly realize that Catholicism is amazingly smart. There's so much intelligence in it. And I think a lot of times we think that, everybody that lived before 1970, just really was dumb or, doesn't know anything like we know and not nearly as smart as us because they didn't have iPhones. And, they can't do anything with a computer back then. But wow, I mean, that is so far off base, right? When you look at what these what these thinkers were doing, so St. Thomas Aquinas is writing about in about the year 1300, okay? When you look about even 1,000 years prior to that with St. Augustine, right? Or any, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of saints with just these towering intellects, right? That just spent their entire lives writing, thinking about, and thinking through what it means. They would hear most of our sermons today that priests are preaching, right? And they would be like, that is so... They would fall asleep because they're like, that's so obvious. The kind of stuff that we're talking about today in our churches and so forth, and what the kind of things that these guys were doing amazing stuff, and it still lives with us today, and we still read it and we're like, wow, that's so powerful, right? So again, St. Thomas Aquinas is kind of the height of this scholastic tradition in the church of really kind of picking apart things. He wrote a book that is called the Summa Theologia. Okay, so the Summa Theologia is probably his great work. It's probably, I want to guess, it's about 1,500 pages. So a lot of times it's split up into 5 books, right? And it is, I beg you to just look up one thing from the Summa Theologia and you'll realize how smart these guys were and how amazing and how proud we should be when we think that, oh my gosh, the only smart people are scientists or atheists today. You realize, no, there's so much here with St. Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics. And so one of the things, I just want to highlight a couple of things that St. Thomas did. Probably his most famous thing that we find in the Summa. But again, every question that he asks and answers in there is worth its weight in gold to read it. But he spends time on his 5 proofs for God's existence, right? And so just to give you an example or a taste of kind of some of the heavy lifting that St. Thomas Aquinas does in this scholastic tradition, he talks about there are 5 ways that you can prove the existence of God in his understanding, in his mind. First of all, the proof of God from motion. And what he says there is that there's everything that we look around, we're all in motion. I'm moving right now, I'm moving my hand. The world is spinning around, at 180,000 miles an hour or whatever it is, right? Everything's moving. The earth is moving around the sun is moving, the universe is expanding. You see all of this motion. He said that you keep tracking back, okay, well, what moved this thing? Well, then it was that. So you keep following this chain of motion and you say, well, what moved that? And then you say, well, that. But eventually, he said, you get to a point where you have to have something that is an unmoved mover, right? The thing that kind of sets motion in motion, right? And that doesn't move himself, right? I am not an unmoved mover. I move myself, right? I am in motion. So if I go and push a ball down the hill, I can't be I'm not an unmoved mover because I'm moving myself. I can't say, well, that's... So he's saying that this unmoved mover, this person that starts motion, but isn't motion and isn't moving himself, is God. A similar proof that he uses is his proof of God's existence from causality. In the same way with motion, everything that we see around us has a cause for why it's there, right? It didn't always exist. And we can all understand and see very easily how everything that we see in the world and in the universe doesn't have to exist forever. It could come to an end, right? Every star comes to an end, and we don't believe that they all just started that way, right? The earth, you and I, right? We know that we're not immortal, and we know that eventually we can come to an end very quickly and very easily. So he says that there has to be something that is the uncaused cause, right? So there has to be something that causes things to happen. If you want to say there's a Big Bang, then who did the banging, right? As I've asked that question before, who caused things to start happening, right? And so Aquinas says, look, if you keep tracing these things back, there has to be something that wasn't caused that causes everything else, and so that's God. Contingency, right? God's existence from contingency. Again, a very similar thinking here, but him saying that, look, we're all contingent on things. We are dependent on certain things happening, whereas if you keep following that back, there has to be something that isn't contingent on everything else. There had to be something that starts that or protects that or keeps that going. The other two arguments that Aquinas makes for the God's existence are a little bit different than the first three. The first three are all kind of similar: motion, cause, and contingency. St. Thomas Aquinas' fourth proof for God is a proof from perfection. Basically the idea that we can all see around us that various things are more or less perfect, right? More or less beautiful, more or less good, more or less, all kinds of things. We see these differences in these things. And so his point is that there has to be something that allows us, that is perfectly perfect, right? That would then allow us to know when we see something or we see whatever is going on in the world or whatever it might be, we hear something. If we hear something and we say that that's beautiful, then we start to eventually we get to that point where we have to say, we have some notion of that which is perfectly perfect, right? So that we base everything else off of in the world when we say something is good. And so Aquinas says that that's God. And then finally, his proof from design is basically saying when we look around us, we see that there is order and structure in the world, and so he's saying that there has to be something that put that order in place, or else we wouldn't be able to perceive it. And he says that is God himself. Okay. He also says here in conclusion on St. Thomas, I just thought that these were really helpful to know. He makes 5 statements about the nature of God that he goes out to prove and set forth. But God is 5 things, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, that we can definitely say. God is perfectly simple, right? So God there's not like this complexity to God in the sense that it's hard to understand or anything like that. Even though, again, the Summa, we're not saying that there's things that you can say and elaborate about God that are very intricate and beautiful and complex at times. But God himself, God in and of himself is simple because God is love. St. Thomas Aquinas says we can also say that God is perfectly perfect. Okay, so there's no flaw in God. There's none of that sort of thing. God is perfectly infinite, right? So God goes on forever. God always was and God always will be. God is immutable, which means unchanging, right? So God doesn't change God's mind. God doesn't get in moods. God doesn't, in any way change in the sense of like we change. We change our mind. We change all of these different things. God is perfectly unchanging. And that's a really important thing. Not everybody thinks of God that way. Sometimes people think of God as having moods, or just kind of changing his mind. Because sometimes he's described that way in the Old Testament. And even though that's not actually what's happening, God doesn't change God's mind on things, even though sometimes he's described in that way. But Aquinas sets out and proves how God, in reality, even though he's sometimes described in the Old Testament in a poetic way or whatever, God actually cannot be a God that changes, and is in some way adapting in that way. And God, then finally, he says God is also one. God, there's a unity, there's a oneness to God that St. Thomas Aquinas points out. Okay, so out of this wisdom that we start to see flourishing, okay, not that these kinds of things weren't present before, but we see a real explosion because of the rise of the university system. The education levels, really start to explode throughout Europe, and we begin to see then this. What always happens in the wake of intelligence is a rise in culture, right? So we all the times we think of intelligence as like math and it's all boring and science and it's all boring and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, what happens is as people become more intelligent, as the intelligence rises, we also see a rise in culture. Specifically, we see like architecture really starts to take off, and this is a medieval Gothic cathedral in the city of Reims. And so it's very famous, but there's thousands, hundreds, maybe thousands of these kinds of cathedrals that are built in these kind of the high Middle Age period out of this idea of this rising understanding and appreciation for mathematics and all of the things that it takes. And you just look at this building, right? And you think about how hard that would be to design that and to build it without any electricity, without any power tools or anything like that. And the people built this in the 1300s and the 1400s, right? And these kinds of cathedrals in St. Peter's Basilica, they did it all without electricity, right? They did it all with their intelligence, and it's just amazing, right? We also see sacred music and really begin to explode, and people start to explore harmonies and all that kind of stuff, and the arts, sculptures, and all these things. Not that stuff wasn't around. I mean, the ancient Greeks had great architecture, great music, and great sculpture. The Romans, but you really just see in the church and in Europe, where the church is largely located in the Middle Ages, you see, because of this rise in intelligence, you just see this explosion of culture going on, and you can still see a lot of it today as you walk around Europe and you visit the different towns. You see the remnants of some of this culture that is still there. Okay. Another thing that we see in the Middle Ages is an appearance of what we call the Mendicant Orders. The Mendicant Orders were typically, there are two types the two biggest ones that we want to focus on. We see the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Okay, Franciscans with Saint Francis. Okay, and the Dominicans with Saint Dominic. These are two amazing saints that show up in the Middle Ages when a lot of times what we were seeing, as we talked last chapter, we were seeing at times a little bit of a corruption in some of the church leadership, whether it was the bishop or maybe the local priest. There was a little bit of power associated with those positions, and so that necessarily invites over time. You're just going to get corruption in the midst of that, right? The Franciscans and the Dominicans, in different ways. The Franciscans, obviously, with St. Francis, he creates this religious order. The mendicant meaning begging. So there's this poverty behind both of these religious orders, right? So St. Francis creates this religious order where they are devoted completely to living a life of poverty, and also, but they were also very devoted to the intellect and to intelligence, and there's great thinkers in the Franciscan order even really early on. The Dominicans were also devoted very much, St. Dominic was very much devoted to preaching and kind of the intelligence and becoming well-educated people in order to be good preachers. So both of these orders spread out across Europe very quickly and helped bring about a renewal, a religious renewal, particularly, again, as I said, in the midst of that clergy that had maybe become a little bit too tied into the power structures. You have these radical people living these lives of poverty and simplicity, helping the poor, and that just kind of that's just totally foreign to so many people who maybe had seen some of the corruption. And then you have the Dominicans going around and preaching, dramatic and living lives of poverty and simplicity, and kind of preaching town to town. And so there was this religious renewal, right? And God's always doing that in the church. God is always renewing the church through movements like that, right? Through movements like raising up St. Francis and St. Dominic, and then letting them, raise these armies really of great people to go out and really kind of help renew the culture, right? And so a great question to ask is, who is God raising up in our midst? Who are the saints that God is raising up in our own culture, in our town, in our parish, right? To help renew the church, right? To continue, the church is always being renewed. And so maybe it's you. Maybe it's you that God is raising up. God's calling all of us to be saints, right? Okay. One final thing here historically as we kind of get towards the end of the Middle Ages and start to head towards the Renaissance time, we want to talk a little bit about the Avignon papacy, because that'll be an important piece. That's an important piece of history, of course. And so just a quick snapshot version of this, so that, I don't want to go into every king and every pope's name and all that kind of stuff, but just to give you a quick snapshot here. In the 1303, there was a king in France, King Philip the Fair, okay? And he basically, for various reasons, had the Pope arrested, okay? He sent troops down from France. He kind of wanted a little bit more control of the church, and so he arrested the Pope, who wasn't playing along with King Philip, okay? So then what happens is that the Pope eventually dies because of that imprisonment, okay, which obviously is not good when the Pope is kidnapped, imprisoned, and then dies. The king then kind of starts to have control. There's a lot of chaos in the church, and King Philip of France, helps ensure that his friend, an archbishop that he liked, was named the Pope. Okay, now that new Pope, Clement V, then what he did was he moves the papacy, the whole thing, the whole show, moves to this town in France where King Philip is the king, of course. And so Clement says, we're going to move this Vatican operation up to a new town from Rome. We're going to leave Rome and we're going to move up to France to this town called Avignon, okay? And so there are seven popes that end up kind of ruling continuously their papacy from France. Okay, now, and then as we get on with this, we'll see this will set the stage for a lot of issues, for the Reformation and some of these other things that come out of this. At one time, there will be some times where there's two popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome, so it's going to get really messy. Well, it's already messy because we have kings kidnapping popes and killing them, right? So it's already a mess. And as we know, the church is actually, a lot of times there's a lot of mess in the church throughout the 2,000-year history, right? But anyways, just want to talk about that for just a second, just kind of lay that foundation of the Avignon papacy, which we kind of see springing up here at the end of the 1300s there and the 1400s as well. Okay, couple questions. What scholastic saint is considered one of the smartest people to have ever lived? Okay, what scholastic saint is considered one of the smartest people to have ever lived? Number 2, what are the 5 ways to prove the existence of God according to St. Thomas Aquinas? What are the 5 ways to prove the existence of God? Number 3, according to him, what are the 5 things that we know about God? What are 5 things that we can definitively say that we know about God? And then the 4th question and the final question, what is the town where 7 popes reigned outside of Rome? Okay? What is the town where 7 popes reigned outside of Rome? Okay? These are your questions. I hope and pray that you have a great week. And please know of my prayers for you. And if I can ever help with anything, don't hesitate to let me know. Hope and pray that you have a great week. God bless.